If there is one thread that runs through Nietzsche's entire philosophy, from the birth of tragedy to Thus Spoke Zarathustra, it is not power, not nihilism, not even the Overman. It is self-overcoming. Self-overcoming is the engine beneath all the rest. Nietzsche does not believe in static identity. He does not believe that the self is something fixed, given, or completed. For him, the self is a field of forces, a dynamic arrangement of drives, instincts, impulses, and interpretations. To remain what one is not stability, it is stagnation. This is why self-overcoming is not self-improvement. Improvement implies refining something stable, polishing a finished object. Self-overcoming implies transformation. It means that what one is today may have to be sacrificed tomorrow. This is a far more radical demand. Nietzsche sees life itself as structured around overcoming. A plant grows by pushing against resistance. A muscle strengthens by strain. A culture develops by confronting tension. Where resistance disappears, growth ceases. The same holds for the individual. Self-overcoming is not about defeating external enemies. It is about confronting one's own limits, habits, fears, values, and comforts, and refusing to treat them as permanent. What once served life must eventually be surpassed if life is to remain strong. This is why Nietzsche says, "You must be ready to burn yourself in your own flame." He means that one must be willing to destroy former versions of oneself. Identity cannot be sacred. If it becomes sacred, it becomes an idol. Self-overcoming also explains why Nietzsche distrusts moral systems. Morality seeks stability. It seeks rules that hold across time. Self-overcoming undermines this by demanding that even one's deepest commitments be tested, revalued, and, if necessary, abandoned. The Overman is possible only because self-overcoming is possible. Without it, the Overman becomes a fantasy. With it, the Overman becomes a direction. Self-overcoming is therefore not optional in Nietzsche's framework. It is the condition of vitality. To stop overcoming oneself is to begin declining. Nietzsche does not ask whether self-overcoming is comfortable. He assumes it is not. Comfort belongs to preservation. Overcoming belongs to strength. To understand Nietzsche at all, one must understand this. He does not ask what you believe. He asks whether you are capable of surpassing what you believe. Self-overcoming is the mark of a life that refuses to become final. At the heart of Nietzsche's idea of self-overcoming lies a deeper opposition. Becoming versus being. Traditional philosophy from Plato onward privileges being. It seeks stability, permanence, and final forms. Truth is something fixed. The good is something eternal. The self is something discoverable and definable. Nietzsche rejects this entire orientation. For him, there is no final being to uncover. There is only becoming, ongoing transformation without ultimate completion. To seek fixed identity is to resist the nature of life itself. This is why Nietzsche distrusts statements like, "This is who I am." Such declarations freeze movement. They turn a temporary configuration of drives into something sacred. Identity becomes a defense against change. Self-overcoming begins where this rigidity ends. When someone treats their beliefs, values, or personality as untouchable, they halt becoming. They stop testing themselves. They begin preserving rather than transforming. Stability, in this sense, is not strength. It is fear of disruption. Nietzsche sees fear of disruption everywhere. People cling to moral frameworks, political identities, and personal narratives, not because they are true, but because they are stabilizing. They protect against the anxiety of fluidity. But life, for Nietzsche, is fluid. Drives shift, circumstances change, power rises and falls. A self that refuses to adapt becomes brittle, and brittleness is the precondition of breakage. Self-overcoming requires accepting that what one currently is may be provisional. Even deeply held convictions must be open to revision. Not because revision is fashionable, but because stagnation is decay. This does not mean becoming is chaotic. It does not mean drifting without direction. Becoming requires strength. It requires the ability to withstand uncertainty without collapsing into nihilism or retreating into dogma. The person who chooses being over becoming seeks security. The person who chooses becoming accepts risk. Nietzsche sees only one of these as alive. The Overman is not a fixed identity waiting to be achieved. He is the symbol of becoming taken seriously, of a life that refuses to crystallize. To remain what one is indefinitely is, in Nietzsche's language, a form of decline. To surpass oneself repeatedly is vitality. Being promises rest. Becoming promises transformation. Nietzsche chooses transformation, and self-overcoming is the path. For Nietzsche, the self is not a single unified subject. It is a plurality of drives, competing impulses, instincts, desires, fears, ambitions, all striving for expression. What we call I is not a stable entity, but a temporary arrangement of forces. Self-overcoming begins with recognizing this plurality. There is no pure, rational self standing above the chaos. There is no sovereign ego fully in control. There are only drives, some strong, some weak, some conflicting, struggling for dominance. The personality that emerges at any moment is simply the result of which drives are currently in command. Most people do not see this. They believe they have a consistent identity. But Nietzsche insists that consistency is often the product of repression. Certain drives are suppressed, others elevated, until a coherent image is formed. Self-overcoming requires something more demanding than repression. It requires ordering, not denial. Nietzsche speaks of giving style to one's character. This phrase is crucial. Style implies form imposed upon multiplicity. It does not erase tension, it organizes it. A strong person does not eliminate conflicting drives. He integrates them into a hierarchy. Weakness, by contrast, allows drives to remain chaotic or suppresses them moralistically. Suppressed drives do not disappear. They turn inward, distort perception, or erupt indirectly. This is where resentment and moral aggression are born. Self-overcoming is therefore a process of restructuring the internal hierarchy. One must examine which drives dominate, which are suppressed, and whether the current order enhances or diminishes vitality. This is not comfortable introspection. It is confrontation. To overcome oneself is not to silence desire, but to decide which desires deserve authority. Some drives must be strengthened, others must be subordinated, still others must be sacrificed entirely. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy becomes surgical. There is no universal formula. Each individual must confront their own internal configuration. What is decadent for one may be creative for another. There is no external rule book. Strength in this framework is not absence of conflict. It is the ability to organize conflict without denying it. The person who cannot endure inner tension will seek external enemies to blame. The person capable of self-overcoming turns that tension inward productively, reshaping the self rather than projecting hostility outward. This internal struggle is continuous. Drives shift over time. Circumstances alter balance. Self-overcoming must therefore be ongoing. There is no final arrangement that guarantees stability forever. Nietzsche's demand is not purity. It is integration, not suppression, but hierarchy, not moral obedience, but self-legislation. The self is not something discovered, it is something composed. And composition requires struggle. Self-overcoming reaches its most difficult point when it turns against one's own values. It is easy to criticize inherited beliefs. It is easy to reject traditions one never chose. What is far harder is confronting values one has embraced, defended, and built an identity around, and asking whether they still serve life. Nietzsche insists that this confrontation is unavoidable. Values are not eternal truths. They are expressions of particular configurations of drives. They arise from conditions, struggles, and psychological needs. What once strengthened life may later weaken it. What once enabled growth may become a constraint. To overcome oneself, one must therefore be willing to sacrifice one's own moral structure. This is where most people stop. They may rebel against society, religion, or authority, but they cling fiercely to their own convictions. They mistake attachment for integrity. Nietzsche calls this stagnation. A value becomes decadent the moment it is treated as untouchable. Creation requires destruction. This does not mean reckless abandonment of principles. It means testing them ruthlessly. Does this value enhance vitality? Does it expand strength? Or does it preserve comfort, protect identity, and prevent further transformation? If a value no longer intensifies life, it must be overcome. This is not a gentle process. It often feels like betrayal. Betrayal of one's past self, of community, of coherence. But Nietzsche sees such betrayal as necessary for growth. The self that refuses to betray itself eventually betrays life. Self-overcoming, therefore, demands courage at the level of belief. It demands that one be willing to lose moral certainty in order to gain creative possibility. Most people cannot endure this loss. They seek stability in systems that promise permanence. Nietzsche calls this the instinct of preservation. It is understandable, but it is not strength. The Overman is possible only because someone is willing to let old values die. To create new values, one must risk standing without any at all. This is the hardest form of self-overcoming, not conquering weakness, but relinquishing the frameworks that once felt like truth. Identity resists this. Ego resists this. Security resists this. But vitality demands it. The person who cannot overcome their own values becomes their prisoner. Self-overcoming must not be confused with self-denial. This distinction is crucial because many moral traditions have already trained people to think that suppressing themselves is a form of strength. For Nietzsche, it is not. Self-denial arises when instincts are declared sinful, dangerous, or impure. Desire is treated as something to be restrained. Aggression is moralized. Pleasure is justified only if it meets certain standards. The self becomes something to discipline rather than something to transform. This produces obedience, but not vitality. Self-overcoming, by contrast, does not begin from guilt. It does not seek to eliminate drives because they are bad. It seeks to organize them because they are powerful. The difference is decisive. In self-denial, one weakens oneself in the name of virtue. In self-overcoming, one strengthens oneself by reshaping internal order. Nietzsche's critique of asceticism is rooted here. The ascetic denies life in order to control it. He believes mastery comes through suppression, but suppression breeds resentment. What is denied does not disappear, it waits. Self-overcoming does not deny instinct. It refuses to be ruled blindly by it. It acknowledges the force of desire and then decides where it belongs in the hierarchy. This is why Nietzsche distrusts moral systems that equate goodness with restraint. Restraint can be necessary, but if it arises from fear or guilt, it produces weakness rather than integration. The self-denying person appears disciplined, but often lives in inattention. The self-overcoming person may appear intense, even unstable, but lives with greater coherence. The difference lies in motivation. Self-denial is reactive. It responds to an external rule or moral demand. Self-overcoming is creative. It responds to an internal demand for growth. One reduces life, the other transforms it. Nietzsche's philosophy is often misread as indulgent or reckless. In reality, it is far more demanding than traditional morality. It does not ask you to obey. It asks you to reconfigure yourself without external guarantees. That is more difficult than obedience. Self-denial seeks purity. Self-overcoming seeks power, not over others, but over chaos within. The ascetic aims to silence the self. The one who overcomes aims to compose it. These are not the same. Nietzsche does not glorify suffering, but he refuses to treat it as an error. In a culture oriented toward comfort, suffering is something to be eliminated as quickly as possible. Pain is interpreted as dysfunction. Difficulty is interpreted as injustice. Nietzsche rejects this reflex. Self-overcoming requires resistance, and resistance is felt as discomfort. When a drive is confronted, when a belief is questioned, when identity is destabilized, the experience is rarely pleasant. There is friction, there is uncertainty, there is loss. The temptation is to retreat into familiarity. Nietzsche sees that retreat as decline. Suffering in the context of self-overcoming is not punishment, it is pressure. It signals that something is being reshaped. Just as muscle strengthens under strain, the self reorganizes under tension. The person who avoids all discomfort cannot grow. They can preserve themselves, but they cannot transform. This does not mean one should seek pain. Nietzsche is not advocating masochism. He is distinguishing between destructive suffering and formative suffering. One weakens, the other strengthens. Destructive suffering arises when tension is internalized without resolution, when resentment festers, when guilt accumulates, when drives are suppressed indefinitely. This is the suffering of slave morality. Formative suffering arises when tension is used to reorganize the self. It is endured consciously and directed toward integration. It produces clarity rather than bitterness. The difference lies in whether suffering is turned outward in accusation, inward in self-hatred, or inward in restructuring. Self-overcoming demands that suffering be faced rather than avoided. It asks whether discomfort is a signal to retreat or an invitation to grow. Nietzsche understands why many choose retreat. Comfort promises safety, but safety without transformation leads to stagnation. To overcome oneself is to accept that some versions of oneself must die. The death of identity is not painless, but without it, no new form can emerge. A life that avoids all suffering will also avoid all depth. Nietzsche does not celebrate pain, he refuses to worship comfort. Self-overcoming stands between the two, using resistance to intensify life rather than diminish it. If self-overcoming is the condition of vitality, why do so few pursue it? Nietzsche's answer is blunt, because it is destabilizing. Self-overcoming threatens identity. It threatens moral certainty. It threatens belonging. Most people build their lives around stability, stable beliefs, stable roles, stable social recognition. To question these foundations feels like stepping into open air. The instinct of preservation is powerful. Once a person has achieved equilibrium, however modest, they resist disturbing it. Self-overcoming appears reckless. Why dismantle what works well enough? Comfort reinforces this instinct. When suffering is reduced and life becomes manageable, the urgency to transform diminishes. The last man does not reject self-overcoming out of spite. He sees no reason for it. There is also fear of isolation. To surpass one's own values often means separating from communities that share them. Nietzsche recognizes that belonging exerts enormous pressure. Few are willing to risk solitude in order to grow. Another obstacle is moral self-deception. People often reinterpret stagnation as virtue. They call rigidity integrity. They call fear prudence. They call preservation responsibility. In doing so, they avoid confronting decline. Self-overcoming also requires energy. It demands attention, introspection, and courage. Exhausted individuals, whether personally or culturally, lack surplus strength. Preservation becomes the rational choice. Nietzsche does not condemn this. He describes it. Most lives aim at survival and modest happiness. Self-overcoming asks for more than that. It asks for willingness to risk disintegration. The person who avoids self-overcoming is not necessarily weak in a conventional sense. They may be competent, kind, and stable. But stability is not transformation. To overcome oneself is to live without final guarantees. Many prefer the safety of fixed identity. The risk feels unnecessary. Nietzsche understands this preference. He simply refuses to call it strength. Self-overcoming is rare, not because it is mysterious, but because it is demanding. It asks whether one values comfort more than becoming. Most people answer that question quietly and choose comfort. Nietzsche's conception of strength is easily misunderstood. It is not loudness, aggression, or domination. It is not the ability to intimidate others or enforce obedience. Strength, in the context of self-overcoming, is the capacity to endure inattention without collapsing into resentment or denial. The weak person avoids tension. They suppress conflict, seek reassurance, or project blame outward. The strong person absorbs conflict and reorganizes it. They do not require immediate relief. They can remain within instability long enough for transformation to occur. Strength, therefore, is integrative. It does not eliminate drives, it ranks them. It does not silence contradiction, it composes it. Where weakness fragments, strength orders. This ordering requires honesty. One must be willing to confront uncomfortable impulses, ambitions, and fears without disguising them in moral language. Nietzsche sees self-deception as a hallmark of weakness. To pretend one is virtuous when one is merely afraid is decline. The strong person recognizes their own aggression, desire for recognition, need for influence, and decides consciously how these drives are to be expressed. Nothing is denied blindly. Nothing is sanctified blindly. This is why strength appears calm rather than reactive. The person who has integrated their drives does not need constant validation. They do not seek enemies to stabilize their identity. Their power is inwardly organized. Self-overcoming depends on this internal organization. Without strength, the attempt to transform oneself collapses into chaos or self-hatred. Strength allows one to dismantle former beliefs without falling into nihilism. Nietzsche also distinguishes strength from mere resilience. Resilience can mean enduring circumstances without change. Strength, for Nietzsche, means using resistance to reshape oneself. It is not passive endurance, but active restructuring. The Overman is not strong because he dominates others. He is strong because he has mastered the art of self-overcoming. He can destroy and rebuild himself without disintegrating. This strength is rare because it requires surplus vitality. It cannot be manufactured through rules or moral instruction. It emerges where life has enough energy to risk transformation. Weakness clings, strength releases. Weakness moralizes, strength creates. Self-overcoming is impossible without strength, and strength for Nietzsche begins with the courage to confront oneself without illusion. Not every act of rebellion is self-overcoming. Not every rejection of norms is strength. Nietzsche is acutely aware that self-overcoming can be counterfeited. False self-overcoming appears when someone destroys values reactively rather than creatively. They reject morality, tradition, or identity, but only because they resent it. Their rebellion is still dependent on what they oppose. This is not transformation, it is inversion. Reactive destruction keeps the old framework intact by defining itself against it. The rebel remains tied to the structure he claims to transcend. His identity depends on opposition. True self-overcoming does not need an enemy. Another counterfeit form appears as performance. One adopts the appearance of intensity, risk, or unconventionality, but without internal restructuring. It is theatrical rebellion, not hierarchical reordering of drives. Nietzsche would call this decadence disguised as strength. False self-overcoming also appears when someone abandons values impulsively without integrating what replaces them. The result is chaos, not creation. Drives remain disorganized. Nothing new stabilizes. This kind of instability often leads to bitterness. The individual blames the world for the consequences of their own lack of integration. Once again, resentment replaces transformation. True self-overcoming is quieter. It may not look dramatic from the outside. It involves sustained internal work, reorganizing motivations, clarifying values, discarding what weakens, strengthening what intensifies life. The difference lies in whether destruction serves creation. If values are rejected only to shock, provoke, or retaliate, the self remains reactive. If values are relinquished because they no longer enhance vitality, and new ones are consciously legislated, that is genuine overcoming. Nietzsche's philosophy demands more than rebellion. It demands authorship. False self-overcoming seeks freedom from restraint. True self-overcoming seeks mastery of form. The first collapses into chaos or resentment. The second produces strength. Self-overcoming must not become another slogan. It is a disciplined, creative act, not an emotional reaction. Eternal recurrence is not a separate idea floating beside self-overcoming. It is its ultimate test. If self-overcoming is real, then one must eventually ask, could I will this life, with all its errors, weaknesses, and transformations, again and again, without alteration? Recurrence exposes whether overcoming was genuine or merely reactive. If one's transformation was driven by resentment, revenge, or temporary anger, recurrence becomes unbearable. To relive those states eternally would be intolerable. One would wish to edit, erase, or justify. But if self-overcoming was affirmative, if values were created consciously, and one's internal hierarchy genuinely reorganized, then recurrence becomes possible. Recurrence does not test perfection. It tests affirmation. To say yes to recurrence is to say, I do not need redemption. I do not need revision. I do not need a different past. That is the deepest expression of self-overcoming. Most forms of self-improvement still rely on future compensation. One tolerates present struggle because it will pay off later. Nietzsche removes this consolation. There is no final reward, there is only repetition. Self-overcoming that depends on future salvation collapses under recurrence. Self-overcoming that affirms life as it is can endure it. This is why recurrence is called the heaviest weight. It removes escape. It removes metaphysical justification. It leaves only one question: can you will this? The last man cannot. His life is arranged around comfort. Recurrence would trap him in permanent mediocrity. The one who overcomes himself repeatedly, however, may be able to say yes, not because life is painless, but because it has been shaped consciously. Recurrence forces honesty. It reveals whether transformation was authentic or cosmetic. Self-overcoming without recurrence risks becoming another form of hope. Recurrence without self-overcoming becomes despair. Together, they demand something extraordinary, a life so integrated that it can be affirmed without condition. Self-overcoming does not end in stability. It ends in creation. To overcome oneself is not merely to remove weakness or reorganize drives. It is to reach a point where one can legislate values rather than inherit them. Creation is the outward expression of internal reordering. Nietzsche uses the language of legislation deliberately. The creator does not discover universal truths. He establishes interpretations that organize life. This is not arbitrary invention. It arises from a strengthened hierarchy of drives. When the self is disordered, creation is impossible. Expression becomes chaotic, reactive, or imitative. Only a self that has integrated its internal tensions can project coherent form outward. This is why Nietzsche links art, philosophy, and law-giving. All three involve imposing structure upon chaos. The artist shapes material, the philosopher reshapes concepts, the lawgiver reshapes values. Creation is therefore an extension of self-overcoming. If one has not surpassed inherited values, one can only repeat them. If one has not reorganized one's internal drives, one can only project confusion. Creation demands prior transformation. This also explains why Nietzsche sees genuine creators as rare. Creation requires the courage to stand without moral guarantees. It requires the willingness to risk misunderstanding. It requires surplus strength. The person who has overcome himself does not create out of resentment. He does not create to attack enemies or seek validation. He creates because his internal order demands expression. Creation is not reaction, it is overflow. Nietzsche's ideal is not rebellion, but authorship, not destruction for its own sake, but destruction in service of form. Self-overcoming culminates in the ability to say, "These are my values. This is my interpretation. This is the form I give to existence." Without creation, self-overcoming becomes endless internal work. With creation, it becomes cultural force. The Overman is not defined by superiority. He is defined by the capacity to create after overcoming himself. Self-overcoming is the preparation. Creation is the manifestation. Self-overcoming cannot culminate in a final state, because any final state becomes another limitation. The moment a person declares themselves complete, morally secure, philosophically settled, psychologically finished, the process has already stopped. What was once transformation hardens into identity. Nietzsche rejects completion. Life does not stabilize without decline. A finished self is a closed system. It resists revision. It defends its structure. It becomes conservative in the deepest sense, not politically, but existentially. Self-overcoming, therefore, has no resting point. Every hierarchy of drives that is established will eventually require revision. Every value that strengthens life under one condition may weaken it under another. What once represented growth may later represent stagnation. The danger is not failure, the danger is satisfaction. This is why Nietzsche distrusts moral peace. Peace often signals that conflict has been silenced, not resolved. Tension is necessary for movement. Movement is necessary for vitality. Self-overcoming demands vigilance against one's own success. The values one creates must eventually be subjected to the same scrutiny as the values one inherited. Nothing is sacred, not even one's own achievements. This does not mean endless instability or chaos. It means openness. It means refusing to treat any arrangement as final. The strongest individuals are not those who conquer once, but those who repeatedly reorganize themselves without collapsing. There is no ultimate arrival in Nietzsche's philosophy. There is only continued becoming. The Overman is not a finished product. He is the name for a life that has made overcoming habitual. Self-overcoming never ends because life never ends its movement unless it declines. To stop overcoming oneself is to begin preservation. To preserve indefinitely is to decay. Self-overcoming is therefore not a phase. It is a discipline, one that must be renewed continually. This is the cost of vitality.